Good afternoon and welcome to IHA's Webinar Wednesday. Today you will be hearing from our presenter, Brian Mack, the co-founder of Workforce EDU. He will be speaking today on can you spot the right talent faster than your competition? And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Brian. Brian?
Great, thanks so much, Ginny, and Debbie as well, who I know is on the line. And thanks to all of you who are taking a few minutes out of your day to join us. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to the conversation. The topic on deck for today is something that we know is on the mind of a lot of people these days, especially the IHA members, and that is how to spot the right talent, and ideally, faster than your competition, because while the war for talent has been an issue for some time, it's becoming acutely of concern now with the improving economy. And I'd like to spend a few minutes today talking about an approach that we believe that can really help in terms of overcoming some of those challenges. And so we'll spend the next few minutes going through some of the challenges that we see, some approaches that we think that can really be of help to dealing with that, and then ways to potentially implement some of those practices. We'll be taking questions at the back end, so feel free to enter those into the chat box at any time, and we'll make sure to address those at the end. And so just to move forward here, we will go ahead and just really start with a little bit of a baseline assessment of where we are today. It's hard to believe that 7 years ago was the publication of the seminal Gallup research that culminated in their report and book called the Coming Jobs War. And at the time, it wasn't that far removed from the Great Recession when it was hard to believe that, hey, we would ever have a labor shortage given the surpluses that we were seeing at the time. But lo and behold, flash forward a few years, and we're really seeing a very different, not only domestic job situation, but a global job situation that is really putting employers in greater and greater need of ever improving talent. And as you may have seen in the headlines recently here in the States, there are now more jobs open than people looking for work, which again is hard to believe how far that trend has come just in the last few years. And the implication for employers today is that in order to remain competitive, we really need to hire the right people and invest in their development in a way that we might not have had to have done in previous years. The challenge, however, is that the standard practices for really sussing out whether someone is a good fit for a role is challenged, because resumes seldom tell you very deeply about how each applicant has the skills that they're bringing to the job and if they're likely to be successful for the company. There's all sorts of manners that people will use to present themselves, obviously in the best possible light, but it doesn't always reflect the things that they can actually do for you on day one. And so now more than ever, employers are really looking for and needing better ways to spot those who can hit the ground running, to look for the diamonds in the rough that might not be obvious, and to give themselves a better pool to select from and a better sense of assurance that who they are moving forward in their hiring process or their training process is really poised to succeed. And so just to kind of calibrate for a moment in terms of how big that challenge really is, some recent studies and reports I think have really kind of put this into focus, at least for us and many of the people that we've been talking to recently. North of 80% of companies are reporting that they're struggling with some sort of skills gap in terms of being able to meet the requirements of the jobs that they have, to meet the demands that their customers are putting on them. And to that point, over 3/4 cite that they believe it's hurting their ability to grow. So it's not just something that's a challenge, it really is having increasingly an impact on their bottom line and in many cases even their top line to be able to meet the demands that they're seeing in the marketplace. And this was from several months ago, but at that time it was up to 40% of jobs, and I think is even higher now, of jobs that are going unfilled due to a lack of qualified applicants. And this is happening across sectors, some more so than others, but is certainly signaling a need in the market and a gap that finding the people with the right talent to be able to grow the business in the way employers really need to is increasingly becoming an issue. So it's causing people to look in new ways, new areas, and adopt some new practices for how to find the talent that's really going to be able to carry them forward. So probably the reason for each of us being on the call today is that we at least recognize some of these issues, maybe are dealing with them acutely. And so rather than just focusing on the challenge, which probably is something that people feel familiar with, we'd like to turn our attention to, so what can we do about this? What are some of the options that employers have, and what are some of the new and novel ways that employers are increasingly starting to look at to deal with this very formidable challenge? So one of the things that we found that is not necessarily new, but being done in new ways, is looking for really at the evidence of the skills that are mattering most for success. And some of the research that we and others have done have really dove into what are the particular skill sets that are really aligning to success on the job. And this is from some research and polling from across different employers in terms of what they are looking at as those indicators of success. And it's a blend of both hard skills and soft skills, increasingly a focus on soft skills in particular, that are corresponding to ultimate success on the job. Skills like working in a team, problem solving, prioritizing work, communication, and being able to influence others and to analyze data. We won't go through this list, you can see them here, but increasingly these are the things that employers and academic research as well is signaling as those indicators, those precursors, or those markers of success on the job. And so on this kind of premise is what Workforce EDU has been built and is focused on in terms of knowing that these are some of the core skills that matter the most for success. How can we start to look at that in a way, decompose jobs, and construct that with what people's abilities are to find matches that are going to be successful. So a little bit about Workforce EDU, just as a background on us. It's a foundational work skills and training program that we have that spans all industries. We are really focused on helping both prospective and current employees really master and demonstrate specific skills that are calibrated to different occupations. And we do this through a whole person kind of training philosophy that encompasses a process that includes some skills diagnostics, training where there are gaps or needs relative to their goals and aspirations, and then also being able to earn an employer recognized credential called the Ready to Work credential that helps them very quickly and easily demonstrate to employers and or other support people that they're working with to be able to show that they actually have the skills for the jobs that they're applying for. So just a little bit more background in terms of where this approach and philosophy is coming from with the history of Workforce EDU. We're actually partnering with Win Learning, who is the original developer of this program over 20 years ago that's been used extensively in the public sector. We will talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But basically, we are bringing a solution and a series of tools into this mix, into this problem that's been used, again, in public sector situations, but we see a lot of need that's been escalating and increasing in the private sector to take that and bring that to a new environment. And so we'll get into some of the examples of how this has been used and where this has been used before. but just wanted to give a little bit of background that this isn't a brand new idea. In fact, it's decades old, but the application of it is being used in new ways and in different ways that we think can help people really overcome this skills gap that we're seeing in the marketplace. So we'll get into some examples here in just a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about what this skills diagnostic and the skills benchmarking approach really looks like. And so what we do is really look at those core skills that are resident within almost every job and start to decompose those in a way that we can basically look at what a job needs and what a person can bring to the table and use that as a basis for matching them up. So there are a few areas here in particular that we focus on because we've seen these in different levels across almost every job that we've profiled. So for example, applied math is an area that's used in every day in almost any job, but to varying degrees. So for an example, to provide a customer quote, a person has to be able to do some basic calculations. If they're in an environment that's related to housewares or retail or many other industries, there is some level of math in most every job. Some more sophisticated than others, but what we're able to do is go in and look at what each of those skills are actually required in that particular position or that occupation. Same thing for reading. Reading is, and reading comprehension in a business setting, an applied setting, is different than what might be taught in a traditional academic setting, but being able to interpret and convey that, for example, policies throughout an organization is drawing upon reading for information. Two other skill areas that are also very important that are part of the focus that we have is locating information. Sometimes this is called graphic literacy, but it's really the ability to use charts, numbers, tables, etc., maps in a business setting. And again, because of the ability to convey that information quickly, these types of production and consumption skills with information are increasingly important in a digital economy. Last but not least is an area that we call the professionalism skills, aka soft skills. And you may have seen this as well, but we've seen a lot of research emerging lately about how important the professionalism or soft skills are in terms of really determining success and longevity in a job. And these are the attitudes, the behaviors that people are bringing to the table. For example, teamwork and collaboration, professionalism, critical thinking and problem solving. Those types of skills are very, very important for success on the job, and even more so in some cases than traditional hard skills like math and reading and locating information. But we really look at both because all jobs have those to varying degrees, and all of those are important calibration points to consider when looking at individuals in terms of their fit for particular jobs. So at a glance, what this really looks like in terms of our approach and the philosophy for bringing this together in a way that can actually help address these challenges is looking at the transferable skills through diagnostic and training programs. From there, we are leveling and benchmarking thousands of different jobs relative to those levels that we have in each of those areas to the left. So for over 1,000 different jobs, we've gone in and done job analyses to see what does, for example, a machinist need versus a pharmacy aide versus a customer service representative. Over and over and over again, we're able to really decompose those jobs into their kind of core skill requirements, their foundational skill requirements, and map that back to a series of levels that then a person can compare their skills against, either in quick diagnostic fashion or in a more robust type of certification fashion, which is that last column there that we have not only diagnostics that are very quick, we also have certification capabilities, which are proctored exams that demonstrate the competencies and proficiencies of individuals. So both have a role. Both can be used at varying degrees within a recruiting or training and development environment. But at a glance, this is what we really have seen over and over again be successful in terms of identifying that right talent, spotting diamonds in the rough, and even in some cases helping understand the skill profile of existing employees to be able to help them develop their career path within a company. So just to give a couple of examples of how this really looks and works, just two that we'll use here as a quick example. That decomposition of jobs is illustrated here on both of these examples. For example, a purchasing manager might have a skill profile, depending upon their industry and level, of an applied math at a level 7, reading at a level 5, and locating at a level 6. Likewise, a customer service role, again, depending upon the industry, could be higher or lower than this, might have a different skill profile of, say, math of 6, reading for 5, locating, or reading for 6 and locating for 5 as well. We do this hundreds and hundreds of times over. Well over 1,000 different occupations have been benchmarked with these unique profiles. And by virtue of doing that, we're very quickly able to give an employer an ability to look at what are the specific skills, foundational transferable skills that someone coming into this job can be successful at. And likewise for candidates, being able to quickly assess their fit for the potential roles that they're looking for. And in an applied situation, just taking this back to the Housewares example, I know the membership base of IHA has a number of different roles for any one of the companies that you're representing. So it could be in whether it's sales, marketing, production, support, any one of a number of roles. And as an example, how this could be used in practice is by looking at someone with a background that might not be obvious. They might not have had work experience in your industry or work experience in the particular job for which you are hiring. By being able to look at the skill profile or the skill level of that job and looking at candidates through that lens, you'll be able to find people who otherwise might not be an obvious match. So for example, a marketing manager may have a very similar core skill profile that could make them successful as a storage and distribution manager. Again, these are just examples, but I think it hopefully makes the point that because of that, looking at someone who might be coming in with a background that might not be obvious, which is increasingly the case in a hot job market, gives you an ability to look at people through a lens that might not otherwise be obvious through these transferable skills. And same thing that non-traditional candidates can be really identified by having a quick skills diagnostic throughout the course of the recruiting process to be able to identify someone who really has that ability to hit the ground running. On that point too, what we're seeing increasingly is companies not just looking at these types of processes outside of their companies, but also looking at them within, because many of the best recruits can already be people who are on staff, but just in a different role than what their next career aspiration or potential might be. So the application for this type of philosophy or this type of approach we see is not only looking for candidates externally and really cutting down the time and the uncertainty involved with that, but also as a development opportunity within an organization for those who might not be obvious fit for a role or might have hidden skills that might have gone undetected that could be applied and leveraged in other places in the organization. So we've seen applications of both of those, but in today's environment, I think a lot of the focus is on that outside recruiting, that external talent acquisition. And so being able to quickly spot either by virtue of someone coming with that credential already in hand or by quickly diagnosing their aligned skill sets within the course of that recruiting process are both very real options. Just a little bit about the background. I mentioned that this is not a new program, or that it's not a new approach, that it's been used in many places in the public sector. I wanted to give just a couple of examples for where that is playing out already. The slide that you see here shows that there are actually many states who have already adopted this kind of approach in this particular program. State of Florida, Arizona, South Carolina, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana all have established statewide sponsored programs where they're using this approach through their workforce training and development initiatives. They're deployed a little bit different across each state. Florida has been using this, I think, for the last 10 years plus, and is really a requirement for anyone collecting unemployment benefits. They've seen so much advantage of people going through this process to be able to diagnose and develop and express their skills, and on the employer side being very beneficial in terms of being able to see that proof, that evidence that someone can be successful for the roles that they're hiring for, has made that something that's continued to be renewed over and over and over again, and was just done so again over the last few months. So state workforce agencies, state departments of education are increasingly turning to these types of approaches, and this solution that we've been talking about in particular is a way to really not only boost the skills of individuals, but to create a pipeline of talent that can be ready-made for employers to take advantage of. Speaking of employers, here's just a few that have actually used this solution and this approach to really help fill their pipeline of talent. This is by no means exhaustive. There are many more that are using this in varying degrees within their hiring and training and development processes, but clearly these are some of the ones that some brands that you would probably recognize that are really starting to look at these types of methods and deploying them more broadly to be able to fill their very significant talent needs across their organizations. Now, a few of them have actually gone the next step to really not only adopt some of these programs, but also to test them and document them along the way. And a few that really stood out for us that I just wanted to use here, because sitting in the shoes that you all are, you're probably looking for, okay, this might sound great, but what's the evidence of benefit or impact? And a few of these in particular have done their due diligence research, the before and after effects of really using this type of approach. And some of the things that they've seen are really improvements in reductions in new hire turnover, which is always an issue, I think, especially in some industries like housewares, making sure that they're getting the right people in the door to begin with and giving them the right kind of fit for the skills that they have is a critical factor in reducing turnover, and turnover is something that impacts the bottom line directly. PGT is an example as well, also saw very significant reductions in performance-related turnover, and also a cut in training time, because being able to identify the right people coming in to begin with really is shortening the requirement of having to train people up from scratch. And then last but not least, a great example from Northrop Grumman, where they really used the system to assess and develop their employees' foundational skills. They were seeing reductions in recruitment time, reduced turnover in the first year, and very specific savings per new hire for recruiting costs, and the savings from reduced turnover in a way that far exceeded their investment in this type of approach. So those are just some examples of some leading companies that are really starting to embrace this philosophy of really looking for specific skills that have been benchmarked to the occupations and the jobs that they have open, to really be able to make sure that they're making the most of the scarce resources that even these great companies have to apply to that very daunting task. And again, because this is getting more and more acute with the booming economy, it's even more important than ever that employers are using these sorts of tools, these sorts of approaches, these sorts of philosophies to make sure that they're spotting the right talent faster than their neighbor down the street, and are able to make the right decisions that are going to be a good fit for the employee and for the job to see these kinds of benefits. So in terms of an implementation, that could be a whole conversation in and of itself, but really simply, it's basically something that's not very complicated. The approach that we've taken is very much turnkey, that includes an online access that's totally configured within a matter of an hour or two. It's all online. It's 100% self-paced, self-driven, and so the setup for these sorts of things does not take very long. A couple of days, it's really only a few hours within a particular day to do a full configuration and then deployment, which is the biggest task there, is really just around communication and setup internally, as opposed to using the platform itself. So again, being able to adopt these sorts of tools, these approaches, these techniques, doesn't have to be a hard thing to do. In fact, for most people, it's very easy to embed within the rhythm of their current processes. So just to try to round the corner here and summarize, because I want to make sure we have some time for some Q&A. I think we all probably recognize that the war for talent is in full swing. Certainly the data and the headlines that we're seeing are really supporting that. It doesn't look to be ebbing anytime soon. So hiring the right people is really key to remaining competitive. You can make the case that it always has been, and that's true, but it's getting to be even more of a competitive dynamic today, when there are, again, more jobs open than people looking for work. And from what we've seen from the evidence certainly in the public sector, and increasingly in the private sector, is that using those transferable skills, looking for those in the hiring process and in the training and development process that have been benchmarked to jobs, is a really great and effective way of spotting people who can hit the ground running and who can be successful in the role. And taking this approach isn't something that requires a forklift upgrade. It's not something that requires a lot of time and effort to do. Slight tweaks to the current process that you have are probably all that's needed to really start to take advantage of some of these approaches, some of these methodologies, and some of these tool sets. So with that, I know I've gone through fairly quickly, but wanted to make sure that we had time for questions and also be respectful of our collective time together. So with that, I will pause for breath and turn it back over to Ginny to see if there are any questions that folks have or comments.
Great, thank you so much, Brian.
Yes,
do have a few questions. One, how are the skills benchmarks created?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the benchmarks that really underpin our approach were really created over a number of years through very diligent and detailed job analyses. So for example, a production manager or a facilities manager, the profile for that job was done through interviews of incumbents actually in that role. So it's something that is a byproduct of formal job analyses. It's also a product of some other data aggregation, labor market data that we look at, skills trends, but mostly it relies upon some very detailed job analyses with incumbents who are helping us validate what's actually needed on the job versus what does someone else think might be needed on the job. So that's what gives us a lot of comfort to say when we say a job requires level 5 or level 6 of this particular skill, that it's really the people who are doing the work that are helping us feel comfortable and can validate that that's actually the case. So great question, appreciate that.
Great. One more, here we go. How does a system like this fit into a typical recruiting process?
Yeah, that's a question that we get a lot, actually, and it will vary obviously by company, but in general, there's kind of two paths that we've seen for how an approach like this or tools like this can get incorporated into a recruiting process. The first one is probably the simplest, and that's just looking for and or asking for any certifications that people can bring in. So for example, our certification of these skills is called Ready to Work, the Ready to Work credential. It can be as simple as like, you've probably seen the ads, ask for the Carfax, In this situation, it's an analogous ask for the certifications or the credentials that align to those transferable skills. There are a couple of out there. Ours isn't the only one, but it's certainly one of the more prominent ones. So the simplest way is just to ask for that and pay attention to it in the recruiting process. The second one is a little more active versus passive, and that is actually weaving it into the recruiting process itself. So this could be after the initial screening. It could be early on, still in the interview, where a candidate is asked to take a quick self-paced diagnostic that could be on-site, could be off-site, that basically allows them to see what their skill levels are in these benchmark skills for the job, and the recruiting or hiring manager as well. So that's another way that employers have really started to, and some of the case studies that we were talking about before, really used that approach, where they were embedding this at the appropriate time in their interview funnel. It's probably not the first thing, and certainly not the last. It's usually somewhere in the middle, that there's the skills diagnostic. It usually doesn't take too long, that the candidate goes through, and then that's part of the information that they look at as in terms of whether to advance that individual or not. So it's really those two predominant modes. There's maybe a few others as well, but those are the big two.
And does this program take a while?
Actually, it doesn't. In fact, from a recruiting perspective, for someone to go through that diagnostic, if they don't already have any of that evidence on their resume already, or that certification on the resume already, it really probably takes less than an hour. Depends upon the individual. Some could take less time than that, some could take slightly more, but it's not a big investment on the candidate's time or the employer's time to weave this into the recruiting process. Now, if they're using it for the training and development perspective for internal candidates, again, it could be a very light touch kind of diagnostic. If they choose or want to use more of the full-fledged online training and the proctored certification, that could take more hours. But typically for a recruiting scenario, it's an hour plus or minus of maybe a few minutes on either side. So very low footprint in order to be able to take advantage of this type of approach.
Well, that's great. We have no more questions. Those were great. And on behalf of IHA, I would like to thank Brian for such a great and informative webinar. And for all of you that are here today, please go to our website at www.housewares.org, and it will be on our, to hear it again or to send it on to anybody, it will be on our website. So once again, thank you, and all have a great Wednesday. Thanks again, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.